Alice Paul was born on January 11, 1885 in Moorestown, New Jersey. She grew up in Quaker tradition and based her suffrage movement on Quaker principle. She moved to England in order to study sociology and met British woman suffragist Christabel Pankhurst. After attending her seminars, Alice Paul was strongly inspired and pursued the path of suffragist. She attended many women's rights protests in England and met her lifelong companion, Lucy Burns. In 1910, Alice returned to the U.S. and joined the National Woman Suffragist Association. However, she quickly resigned from the group because NASA's approach was too slow-paced and focused on a state-scale reform. Alice Paul believed in radical and national-scale reform. Therefore, she started looking for other ways to achieve women's suffrage. After her split from NASA, Alice Paul joined with her friend Lucy Burns and decided to establish the National Women's Party in 1916. She also organized a parade in Washington the day before Wilson's inauguration. However, due to her radical movement and anti-World War I sentiment, Alice Paul and her companions were arrested. Alice Paul went for a hunger strike and finally released from the prison in November 1917. Her continuous effort put pressure on Wilson administration and finally passed the 19th Amendment in 1920s. Contrary to what most people believe, Alice Paul did not promote the birth control. The application of birth control was promoted by another individual called Margaret Sanger. Born on September 14, 1879 in Corning, New York, Margaret Sanger was a birth control activist who changed how American public viewed sexuality and birth control. During the early 20th century, abortion was despised by many people. However, just like any despised activities such as prostitution and gambling, birth control and abortion were used by many people. This illegal abortion was called black alley abortion and was very dangerous due to lack of sanitization and lack of professional knowledge. Margaret Sanger, who wanted to put an end to such hideous actions, opened the first birth control center in the United States in 1916. However, she was soon arrested by police and birth control center was shut down. In the court, Margaret explained the need for birth control, and this trial soon rose controversy over contraception and sexuality throughout the U.S. Later, she opened new birth control center for both white and black Americans and founded American Birth Control League in 1921. Her advocacy on birth control resulted in a court decision of 1936 to allow physicians to obtain contraceptive and advice on birth control. In the early 1900s, many changes were spurring thanks to active actions of women. Among these women, Frances Perkins was one of the most iconic figures in the political area. No one expected the girl who was born in Boston would become first woman secretary. As a Secretary of Labor under Roosevelt administration, Frances Perkins almost always supported Roosevelt in establishing New Deal and starting social reform. She also championed minimum wage by proposing First Labor Standard Act and established unemployment insurance law. Her desire for social reform led to standard 40 hours work a week policy and banning of child labor. Perkins' work on civilian conservation corps even led to the creation of modern Social Security. Frances Perkins was the most active woman policymaker who brought significant change to the U.S. during the 20th century. Frances Perkins wasn't the only unconventional political figure during the 20th century. The First Lady of Roosevelt, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, also brought unprecedented change in the role of First Lady and society. Before the Eleanor Roosevelt became First Lady, the First Lady wasn't a prominent political figure. However, Eleanor Roosevelt actively participated in politics and redefined the role of the First Lady. Eleanor Roosevelt's active participation in social reform and support for establishment of New Deal are the most evident examples of her political career. She established resettlement community in Arthurdale for homeless miners. She also invited famous African American guests such as Marian Anderson and Mary McLeod Bethune to White House. Inviting African American along itself was very controversial at the time, and First Lady leading a new campaign in social reform was totally mind-blowing for American public. Her use of mass media, such as holding 378 press conferences, boosted her public support and resulted in successful social reform. The debut of Eleanor Roosevelt in politics as First Lady changed how the American views the First Lady and accelerated the social reform.
In 1903, the National Women's Trade Union League was established to advocate for improved wages and working conditions for women. It was founded in Boston in 1903 as a coalition of working-class women, professional reformers, and women from wealthy and prominent families. Its purpose was to assist in the organization of women's wages workers into trade unions and thereby to help them secure conditions necessary for healthful and efficient work and to obtain a just reward for such work. It showed a bond, no matter what the class was, between empowered women. In 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns from the Congressional Union worked towards the passage of a federal amendment to give women the right to vote. The group is later renamed the National Women's Party. While this was all going on, the members of the Union picketed the White House and practiced other forms of civil disobedience. When picketing the White House, they started off silently holding picket signs, reading, "How long must women wait for liberty?" and "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" In total, 218 protesters were arrested. As Peter mentioned earlier in this presentation, in 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first U.S. birth control clinic in Brooklyn, New York. Although the clinic is shut down 10 days later and Sanger is arrested for distributing birth control information, she eventually wins the support through the courts and opens another clinic in New York City in 1923. In 1919, the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment, originally written by Susan B. Anthony and introduced in Congress in 1878, is passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate. It is then sent to states for ratification. In 1920, the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor is formed to collect information about women in the workforce and safeguard good working conditions for women. Another key point in 1920 is August 26, 1920. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution granting women the right to vote is signed into law by Secretary of State Bainbridge Kilboy. In 1921, once again with Margaret Sanger, she finds the American Birth Control League, which later evolves into the Planned Parenthood Federation of America in 1942. As a side note, Planned Parenthood is a non-profit organization that does research into and gives advice on contraception, family planning, and reproductive problems. In 1935, Mary McLeod Bethune organizes the National Council of Negro Women. This is a coalition of black women's groups that lobbies against job discrimination, racism, and sexism. In 1936, the federal law prohibiting the dissemination of contraceptive information through the mail is modified, and birth control information is no longer classified as obscene. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, though, birth control advocates are engaged in numerous legal suits.